Motherfuckers. This month in the Traumatized Motherfuckers private club over at patreon.com/traumatized motherfuckers, we continued talking about somatization and re-victimization issues, specifically how the throat and voice are affected by trauma. More specifically, by one type of childhood trauma that it all funneled down to: emotional neglect. We jumped into research articles about voice perturbations in singers, changes in language between depression and PTSD symptomology, and differences in the experiences of so-called laryngo responders versus non-laryngo responders in reference to the larynx. Hint: unideal communication post-traumatic events seems to lead to unideal throat functionality. Another highly, quote, coincidental way that maltreatment later presents as an ironic physical outcome that lacks medical explanation, i.e., being trounced all over, having no say in life, and later developing a weak backbone or several. So, while I recommend checking out each of those individual research article episodes, reminder, available in summary form at Traumatized Motherfuckers on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or with explicit research detail on the Patreon of the same name. Hitting all those excerpts and extra commentary for the real nerds out there. Today, I would rather share with you the conclusion from this somatization research on the throat. When it's pulled together, what seems to be the greatest risk to our later adult functioning? How does it create a pipeline that sends us straight into life destruction? And what can we do about it, even now, as full grown-ups with rutted patterning? Let's talk about emotional neglect. Here's my report. Cheers, y'all. Fuckers! Look, we're going to take a bit of a step back from these intensive research papers today because I wanted to make sure that we're all tracking the results of the recent episodes on somatization, especially from what we learned about the throat. If you're like me, you've been listening along and finding the results interesting, but we have not discussed them in concert, so they have not added up to a definitive answer. Today, let's do a little summary episode, making sure we don't lose the thread and we take away everything that we can from these papers as we trace life from childhood to adult psychosomatization. For the nerdos, we'll cover 3 research papers to expand into new, deeper territory, give you some reflection about neglect experiences and your prevailing patterns afterwards, and validate just how strongly emotions matter in the effort to stave off physiological and psychological destruction. For the rest of us, let's enjoy an easy breezy summary for the summer solstice. Dive into that research bonus if you're feeling extra curious. And with that, here we go. Victim's voice. So, the victim's voice, the vocalization patterns that prior perpetrators can pick out, may be marked by qualities like slow speed, monotony, unemotionality, and perturbations in sound waves. Those inconsistencies can be called jitter and shimmer, and they're found to correlate with insecure, anxious, and avoidant attachment, as well as with shame. But interestingly, diminished voice intensity corresponds with only anxious attachment. And meanwhile, despite this anxious labeling, research showed that voice dysfunction isn't linked with anxiety itself, or, as a small aside, with guilt. So, insecure attachment and shame uniquely affect the voice and throat compared to avoidant attachment and guilt. That means we should talk about anxiety and shame to try to make sense of how they're similar. Now, to switch up how we normally speak about it, anxious attachment is like a preemptive association with negative emotion. Yeah, we don't know that a negative thing is happening within a relationship, but we respond internally and quite often externally as though it is evidentially taking place. Before we know if someone is ignoring, leaving, or trying to harm us, we're quite certain that they are because our mind tells us it's likely per what we've lived through before and because our body is ringing with emotions that align with the resulting emotions of those past experiences, making it all seem like we know exactly what is going on. This is reality, even if it hasn't observably shaken out yet. They're abandoning, rejecting, lying to us, etc. We might feel like this constantly as a steady state at face value, therefore, anxious attachment is, quote, about the other person and how they are treating us. At real value, anxious attachment is about fear that oneself is not valuable enough to be treated well in relationship, and therefore we must be getting treated poorly. And shame is quite similar. It's another preemptive engagement with negative assumptions that can be chronic. They aren't necessarily based on real observations. And just like with anxious attachment, those negative assumptions ultimately are about the worth of the self. Shame tells us you fucked up socially. You'd better fix this or you are at risk of excommunication. It has a function. It keeps us safe in a herd, tribal sort of setting, which we do require to survive as people. But when we are persistently shameful, when this becomes our homeostasis, it loses its functionality. The mistake that we fear we have made is perhaps a generalized sense of having biffed it through potentially unnamed action and consequence. And therefore, persistent shame is also really about fearing that we are not good enough. We are somehow flawed or broken. We're messing things up continually, whether we realize it or not. Therefore, we assume it's always the case. We feel as though we are a burden to everyone, not because we're trying to be, but by birthright or some innate quality. In both cases, anxious attachment and shame, we have a messed up relationship with our self, small s. We have a diminished, probably quite rude and damning self view. Is it surprising then that shame and anxiety come with voice irregularities and diminished intensity? Or does it make sense that a cumulative doubt of one's relational value, how much other people want to have and keep you around, would correlate with uncertain and defeated voice qualities? It tracks and also reveals why these voice qualities, slow speech, monotone, unemotionality, unintentional vocal variations, are detected as signals of a good victim. If we assume the worst about ourselves, that we are valueless or repulsive and on the verge of being abandoned, disposed of, left behind, or pushed away, always, then we're excellent material for abusing. We won't estimate that we have other relationships to lean on or deserve better treatment. We will estimate that whatever maltreatment we receive is just and inevitable, and also a sign of future things to come, which are also just and inevitable. We might even feel comforted by it. We knew it. We were right all along to feel as terrible as we did. So a victim's voice might indicate anxious attachment and or shame specifically, both of which are sturdy stepping stones linking past abuse experiences with the modern day, which predators could be able to discern and realize that they can utilize. Ultimately, because both probably correlate with what? Childhood trauma, abuse, and emotional neglect. Yeah. Childhood emotional neglect affected overall and peak voice intensity in another one of our studies. And the authors suggested that it's potentially because it correlates with withdrawal and a preference for an unstimulated nervous system. These are common methods of coping with emotional dysregulation when we haven't otherwise been taught that we can intentionally care for ourselves. Instead, individuals try to hide themselves as a form of protection against acquiring any system excitement that they wouldn't be able to rebalance. So the voice itself is a danger in these circumstances, and it may be silenced or subdued as a result. All of this, of course, corresponds also with depression and PTSD from childhood abuse, neglect, trauma. We grow to be disempowered in voice and behavior, constantly or cyclically. When we learn that we can't just live life to the fullest, or that we are fundamentally built wrong, or that trying results in disappointment and punishment, we get depression. Depression voice markers include pitch, resonance, harmonies, and sentence duration being reduced. So the voice is flat, short, predictable. There's less expression using varied volume and intensity, and changes in word choice occur as well. Simple sentences, frequent use of common words, and less diversity have been seen. Similar to the victim's voice, depression makes us less vocally expressive, perhaps in another attempt to hide ourselves and avoid challenge that we don't feel we can emotionally handle. Meanwhile, assuming that they can be separate experiences, which is somewhat questioned in the literature, PTSD markers in language and vocalization include language centering around death, negative feelings, anger, and bodily sensations. High word count and more complex grammatical structures are seen. We speak more words for longer, but this means we're actually inserting a lot of unnecessary fluff, which can be overly descriptive or redundant. And that is not too dissimilar from the issue of fragmented speech. With PTSD symptomology, cohesion becomes a problem. We might jumble up timestamps, fail to complete thoughts or sentences, or leap between topics. At least from an outside perspective, it's unclear what exactly we might be trying to say. Plus, it is still not uncommon for unemotionality to be present. These findings suggest that something else is taking place as the mediator between childhood maltreatment, depression, PTSD, and vocal changes. And you'll probably remember that it's also a mediating factor between childhood abuse and substance-related revictimization experiences, something that we covered way back in our first paper. That thing is disassociation. I haven't said it in a while, so I do say disassociation, not dissociation, because I find that disassociation better describes what is happening. All right. In the case of PTSD, disassociation is an issue that both heightens the chances of developing a stress disorder and is an ongoing effect of the stress disorder. Meaning, if we disassociate during a potentially traumatic event, we're more likely to suffer from mental, emotional, and physical dysfunction afterwards. And if that occurs, we're then more likely to disassociate again and again when similarly stressed or overwhelmed, potentially for the rest of our lives. This is where jumbled, incoherent language and chronology make a lot of sense. We don't have a single perspective to speak from. Disassociation is also thought to be an underlying cause or characteristic of depression. If you can't enact your will on the environment, why be present in it? Why be here at all? We conserve energy and protect ourselves from ongoing pains by pulling back from life, by pulling back from being in our lives. Disassociation then shows up in the voice as we try to speak from a semi empty vessel or a container that's holding various unmatching, unintegrated perspectives. Will we speak too much, PTSD, or hardly at all, depression? Research suggests that it depends on which one we're experiencing most strongly at any given time. Again, assuming that the experiences are separate, which is questionable since PTSD is often misdiagnosed as major depression. The two are challenging to untangle. And we're finally getting down to the real point here today because both are enhanced by what type of childhood trauma in particular? Emotional neglect. Remember this from our most recent episode? Laryngo responders, on average, were shown to have more ACEs, more and more severe childhood trauma events, and most significantly, more childhood emotional neglect compared to non-laryngeal responders. So, childhood trauma, abuse, and emotional neglect are connected to destructive and dangerous voice, language, and throat responding outcomes that might bend the ear of predators around us. And one other thing, hidden in the results section of that paper, they had said the DES, that's Dissociative Experiences Scale, includes subscales regarding absorption, becoming overly involved in a memory or a movie, amnestic dissociation, blocking out certain experiences or episodes, and depersonalization, e.g., not recognizing oneself in the mirror. Laryngo responders had higher scores than non-laryngo responders on the DES total score, absorption, and amnestic dissociation. Non-laryngo responders scored higher only on the depersonalization subscale. As we said earlier, disassociation was also correlated with risky behaviors that increase re-victimization experiences, and now it seems to be implicated directly in physiological alterations, both of which might put us in the path of people who can then detect the specific signs that we are not able to presently show up for ourselves. And remember that disassociation was also connected with what? The victim's gate. When we're not present in our own bodies, operating them centrally, we're detached from ourselves. We're operating our body in a similar fashion to our thoughts and words, incohesively. We get fittingly fragmented, inefficient, ungraceful movements. This can also be read by predators. Meaning, post-emotional neglect and post-disassociation patterns being established, our speech and our physical mobility reflect each other, revealing the state of the mind and emotions, which, unfortunately, to outsiders are marked as vulnerable. We're not even in our lives' brains or meat jackets. Feel free to use them as you please. And to tie it all together, with disassociation being such a central feature of these somatization issues, it makes a person wonder, does emotional neglect cause an individual to have no emotional regulation skills, based partially on the poor communications that go hand in hand with parental non-attendance? Does this lack of emotional expertise, while trapped in a helpless state as a child, then lead to disassociation and depression? Because the individual has no other method of handling external or internal threats. Does this action become rooted in the psychological and physiological responses of the individual so that they respond as a child, as an adult, feeling powerless, withdrawing, subduing, hiding, or alternatively pretending that no risks exist? And do these behaviors then put them at risk of encountering predatory individuals while also signaling that they have an internally childlike condition? I have to think So, at least it's one theory that connects these 5 or 6 papers together, each somehow indicating the particular experience of childhood emotional neglect and the absence of learned emotional regulation skills being the predisposing factor leading to disassociation that creates somatization. And from there, amplifies the risk of being identified as a potential victim. We can't say for sure, but the case has been built. To take a lesson away from all of this, examine your relationship to childhood emotional neglect specifically. It might not be the biggest banger in your library of fucked up experiences, and one that you have to think about a little bit further. From there, identify what emotional skills you didn't learn, such as compassionate self talk or processing safely with others. You might also look into emotional regulation tools that are highly effective, such as reappraisal, realizing that you don't have these tools because no one taught them to you. You might pinpoint the ongoing connection between emotional overwhelm and disassociation in your own life. Identify how you cope when you can't comfort yourself or receive it from others. What behaviors take place? What sharks have previously entered the waters while you've not been fully immersed in your own pool or while you've been engaged in those potentially risky behaviors? If this applies to you, try to absorb the lesson that your learned survival response, disassociation, normally hides from you, dooming you to relive it all pointlessly. And now becoming conscious of this, try to break that pattern. When big feelings come up, do something different. Talk to yourself nicely. Talk to people you trust. Work with embodiment practices. Revisit your autobiographical timeline. Stay away from fucked up core beliefs, aka negative self schemas, that might normally drive you to defeat. Insert calming, supportive, curious thoughts. These thoughts can feel delusional because they're so outside of your experience so far that you feel like you do know. But that's just the thing. You've not had the opportunity to behave differently and receive differently so far, largely due to the disassociation. If you've been basing your life on preemptive engagement with negative emotions like anxiety and shame, kickstarting the overwhelm that ultimately tumbles into the same behaviors as always, including abandoning yourself and hoping for the best, you'll get the same behaviors from others in return, as always. And at that point, you probably won't even notice this pattern as you disass away from the pain, but probably wonder, eventually, why you seem to be marked forever as a viable victim. Don't ignore the experience of emotional neglect in your own life and everything that it may have caused henceforth. And with that, well, the nerds are going to cover 3 research paper excerpts today. Come join in for the extended cut if you want to learn more about emotional neglect, disassociation, depression, and physiological ailments. Or get out of here and get practicing being kind to yourself. I know it sounds so gay, but it's a scientifically backed way to break this cycle, heal your emotional brain, and reestablish relationship to your body with the ultimate goal of preventing additional traumas from taking place. Hope this episode helped pull it all together. Thank you for being here. Hail yourself. Hear yourself. Heal yourself. Or something, I don't know, pretty lame like that. And I'll talk to you soon.